Hey my friends, today I'm tuning in with you from between the worlds. I am here at the edge of the forest, connected to the marsh, and this is where all the biodiversity happens. This is one of my favorite places to come because there's lots of different types of plants and the ecosystems are just so rich with life. So today we're going to talk about one of these plants, an old world ally to humans and animals alike. This is Nuphar lutea, the yellow pond lily. In this part of the world, we have the yellow and the white pond lily in the Nuphar species, but these are also related to the lotus in the Nymphaceae family. This family is one of the oldest families on the planet, one of the first evolutions of plants. So similar to the horsetail and the skunk cabbage, they come from that really old world aspect of the evolution of our planet. What they've been doing is they've been cultivating these marsh areas all along the edges of ecosystems for a long time. And traditionally, when you look at the kind of history and the fables and all the rich lore around these, you see that they have a really auspicious spiritual potency to the peoples of the lands that they lived in. The yellow pond lily is pretty easy to identify. Obviously it's growing in the water. This is a water lily. We see that it has these big lily pads. The difference between this and some of the other lotuses and lilies is that the lily pad is quite arrow-shaped and has a nice big slit in it. So that's one of the ways you can identify it. We also, when we look underground or under the water, the roots are these big, long snake roots, and some of the lilies have smaller roots. This one, obviously, the flower is yellow. It has a really interesting kind of almost bottle neck that comes out as it grows, and on the edges of that are the stamens, so really pronounced male and female sexual reproductive parts. This is also kind of synonymous with how it's used for medicine around the sexual reproductive health. But before we get into that, I'll just talk about something that it's pollinated by is a lot of different kinds of bugs and bees and all kinds of insects are attracted to this plant because it has this interesting aroma that is almost like the smell of stale alcohol or brandy, intoxicating for all kinds of creatures, to say the least. Pond lilies, as I mentioned before, are an old world species, and with this comes a lot of old world kind of primitive plant parts. They are a rhizome that divides kind of almost and grows along the edges of these marshes, and they produce these beautiful flowers. So right now it's spring, and these flowers are coming up. This is one of the older ones. You can see it has almost this bottle neck that's coming up out of it, and one of the names for it is actually brandy bottle plant because, one, it looks like a bottleneck, but also when you smell it, this one's past its time. Probably this young flower has that smell. It smells almost like stale alcohol, and this attracts a lot of pollinators. So this plant is pollinated by all kinds of insects that fly in, crawl in, find any way to get into this plant and are a bit intoxicated by its aroma. As you see, these leaves are arrow-shaped. Many pond lilies have a round leaf. This is a big slit with the arrow shape. These roots look like underwater giant snakes. Actually, in one sort of term, they're considered like anaconda. They have these huge, long rhizomes. That's what we're going to use as medicine. But a lot of the food is in the upper parts. So here, one of my favorite parts to work with is the stamen. As you can see, these stamen, I can pull a few off of this one. When they're nice and fresh, I will dry these and make them into a smoke or even add them as a food. They're quite tasty. And often as a food, this was used really the upper parts. So people would eat the smaller, younger leaves before they fully unfurl. Like any edible plant, it's the young parts before they unfurl that are the best food. Here what I have is an unopened flower head, and like many other plants, it's these young parts that haven't produced anti-herbivore chemistry that are what you'd eat. So this is a lot of starch in it. These would be steamed like the young shoots and leaves would be steamed. You also can eat the roots, but the roots are something that there's a lot of, people who say they're not actually that edible. And really what you're supposed to do, because there's a lot of starch in them and they're massive, is to paraboil them 4 to 5 times, peel off the skin and just eat the thick starchy inside. The other thing that we'll see is that these seed heads produce a lot of good seeds. And one of the herbalists, Michael Moore, talks about actually popping these like popcorn. They can be quite tasty when eaten that way. It's really interesting, this plant, when these get fully mature, it actually explodes and these seed heads pop out seeds up to 80 miles an hour, moving fast to fall as far and go as far and wide as they can till they sink to the bottom. And it takes about 3 years for a seed to fully germinate, produce roots, till it actually comes back to another flower head. So it takes a while. These are a permanent part of the ecosystem that are growing mostly by rhizome kind of root division. As you can see out here, these pond lilies can grow really proliferantly in massive amounts as long as there is just a shallow enough place, a little shelf for them to grow on. So before we get into the medicine, I want to share with you a little story that really comes from the lotus flower, which is part of this family, but it relates to the pond lily. And this is almost a Buddhist story, but it's the story of transformation. And this is one of the messages that pond lily brings in this part of the world. Pond lily energetically is good for moving stagnation and turbid, ucky, gooky stuff. One of the things it does is it takes this really harsh environment where it's all just kind of mucky dirt, the edge of the ecosystem where all the kind of funk drifts to, that sort of not so nice environment, and it pushes out of it, transforms it into this beautiful and very clean flower. So the idea of lotus and pond lily is that something beautiful and new is transformed, something clean is rebirthed out of the darkest, grossest, yuckiest soils of our lives. This can be a metaphor for how just the energetics of hanging out with the pond lily can give us a little more reference to our own rebirth and the story around that. I was just walking along the edge of the water and I found a couple of these kind of leftover rotten roots. Now these are not what I want to use for medicine, but this is just a good example. I'm going to actually go and harvest some, but here's an example of how big this root is. And you can see how some of the folklore around this being the underwater cobra or anaconda. It looks like a giant snake. What we want to do with these, I'm going to just chop this one up. See, oh yeah, that's not so bad on the inside. You can see it's got a bit of dark color. We want to look for ones that are bright yellow and lighter. This one's actually not too bad. But you can see, as I chop through this, there's a lot of starch in there. So this is what they would use as food. But again, paraboiled like crazy because there's also a lot of interesting chemistry in here that'll make it quite acrid and bitter. So some of that is what we use for medicine. And this is why this is traditionally the medicine part of the plant, is the root. And you can see, and what I believe is really these long tendrils that come off it are also quite medicinal. As I've seen from many other plants, these parts are, and it looks really similar to skunk cabbage in that sense. This one's really smelly right now because it is rotting. So we'll go back to this one. It doesn't smell as bad. And we'll go and harvest another one in a bit. Despite looking so weird and big and starchy, there's actually a lot of really cool medicinal chemistry in these roots. These contain some anthraquinones and phenolic compounds. They've got saponins, they've got terpenes, they've got tannins, they've got all kinds of carbohydrates and proteins, and a lot of vitamin C and some other minerals. So they're quite abundant in chemistry. Some of this chemistry, when you kind of put it all together, has shown to be really beneficial for the body. Traditionally, the herbal actions of pond lily root are demulcent, astringent, and antimicrobial, meaning it has antibacterial, antifungal qualities. Great for any ecosystem imbalance where we see hot inflammation. So energetically, it is cooling and mucilaginous and just soothing to the tissues and downward moving. This means it's really good for sexual reproductive health and for things like scanty diarrhea, hot inflamed digestive tract, whether that's ulcers or all the way down to like giardia and dysentery and these kinds of things. We can make a medicine out of the root. When we're making a medicine out of the root, it's often used as a powder. So we would take this root, dry it out, powder it up, and use that way. Or we can make it into a tincture, which is a 1 to 2, which means 1 gram of the fresh root with 2 milliliters of alcohol, done in a 75% alcohol, done in your traditional tincture method. That is then used internally or externally, put into a lotion or on the skin. When it comes to working with this on the skin, we see that this root has, again, those cooling qualities. So great for things like boils and rashes. That powdered root was often made as a vaginal douche when there is inflammation and a rash down there, or bladder infection or something along this line, or any kind of irritation to the bum, things like your hemorrhoids, stuff like that. If we've got different sores on the skin, even from acne and psoriasis, this root can have that cooling quality to it, but also boils and things like that. In the mouth, this was often made in a gargle. So you might make a tea out of the fresh root, or even the leaves and the root and the stems in that way, to work with canker sores or inflamed gums. This has been commonly used through many different cultures, especially here on the West Coast and First Nation cultures of the Coast Salish territory that I'm in. They use this as a gargle. This was used often as a medicine for any kind of heat and inflammation. As you can sort of see energetically, it's cool and it grows in the cool waters. So it has that cool quality, transforming conditions like this, right? We'll see things like tuberculosis and hot, irritated hack and cough. This could be another way it can be worked with. And just in general, if there's heat in the body, you might want to think to lotus or lily or these types of medicines as cooling, demulcent medicines to move and downward move that energetically. Beyond Pond Lily's ability to work with heat and inflammation, both internally and externally in the body, there is a lot of promising research around the Nuphar alkaloids that are found in these roots. Those have the capacity to stimulate apoptosis or programmed cell death. This is really cool because we've seen in the folklore that this is useful for cancer and things like that, but now we're seeing actually from the scientific literature that there is the capacity for these alkaloids to really work with that. So the promising research is being done on things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and cancer, and I just hope to see this grow further, and potentially here's one of those medicines that may be really supportive for some deep chronic imbalances of our time. If you are going to work with Pond Lily as medicine, the tincture should be used in about 10 to 20 drops 2 to 3 times a day. It can be made into a decoction, and the mouthwash, either used internally or sponge bathed onto the body, should be done 3 to 4 times a day. And remember that because this is a cooling herb, it shouldn't be used with things where there is already cool, stagnant, damp energy. This is to help move that heat and inflammation. So I'm going to go out and harvest some of these roots. Traditionally, this was done by canoe, but I'm going to get a little bit wet and see how it goes. I've got a hoe from my garden, I've got a basket and a machete. I'll leave that here. Let's just see how we do. I want to get out into the middle here where I've got some nice roots and I can kind of feel them with my toes. Okay, all right, I'm going to get in here and see how deep I got to go. Part of the reason I got the hoe is I want to get down and hook underneath the root and hopefully bring it up. All right, look at this. Here we have some pond lily roots. Now this is enough to make medicine for quite a few people. You don't need much, they're massive, and I'm excited to turn these into tincture, powder, and even try to make them as food. All in all, Pond Lily is an old world energy that helps us transform what no longer serves us. This is an emotional alchemy transformation from the deepest, darkest stuff, removing the heat and inflammation, cooling us down, opening our heart, and bringing us into that new self, right? Like the Buddha, this is the transformation to a form of enlightenment. It moves stagnation in a hot form, right? So this is a great medicine that way. As a flower essence, it's useful for that transformative quality, for helping move neediness and issues around these types of kind of emotional aptitudes. As a smoke, it can be used to help activate our higher self. I've enjoyed this as a herbal smoke that way. It's also got just this beauty to it that helps us recognize that even in the darkest and harshest times, harshest environments, out blooms the most beautiful, brand new version of ourselves. Thanks for joining me in learning about pond lily. This is a just wonderful essence to connect with. I hope you find it in your environment, and I hope you get a little bit of time to find that solace in yourself, to reflect by the side of the pond and hang out with the lilies.